Hello, I'm Alex Otaro.
And I'm Alex Goldstein.
We're a pair of TV nerds with opinions, and this is The Thing That Gets You to the Thing, a Halt and Catch Fire fan podcast.
This week, we're on Season 1, Episode 2, called FUD, which means we're digging into everyone's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And given what we saw in Episode 1, there'll be plenty to go around.
All 40 episodes are on Amazon Prime right now, so each week we'll go episode by episode, digging into what makes it one of our go-to recommendations for anyone who's ever asked us about TV.
Okay then, let's take a peek inside the binder and see what's cooking.
Okay, episode 2.
Okay, episode 2 for them and for us.
Yes, totally. So it picks up right where we left off, which I thought was a smart move because of the way that the pilot was set up, right? And we talked about how important it is to sort of continue that momentum, especially the hard job that an episode 2 has for a freshman series. So I'm glad that that was the case, and sort of you had the scary IBM lawyers sort of coming to get everyone, and certainly give a little bit more insight onto Joe.
When you say momentum, I mean, it goes in at such a high pace. Again, when we had an episode 1 that opened with a high-speed car hitting an armadillo, here we have an episode 2 that opens in a boardroom under pressure, lots of people talking at once. Like they're not going to take their foot off the gas of the sports car just yet.
No, and I thought it was another interesting structure, which we'll get into, because again, it followed that sort of, it had a really good structure throughout in terms of what is going on and sort of that build up. I mean, obviously the first episode's last scene with the three of them sort of almost coming to terms with sort of what they were going to do. I'm really glad that Cameron got a lot more screen time in this one. I felt like this episode was almost all about Cameron in a way, right?
Yeah, she absolutely gets her due. And like we both commented on, we hadn't remembered how little screen time Cameron gets. And I think this is why we didn't remember how little screen time she gets, is because almost immediately the writers go, okay, it's time to bring out this character. She is going to be more important than you think. She's not just a foil for Joe. There's a whole other strand going on here. And like it takes pains to unpick some stuff for her and start to leave a bit of a breadcrumb trail for her. So you get the very distinct impression that, like, don't overlook Cameron. She's not just a stroppy teenager, overgrown teenager. She's actually going to be quite an important driving force in the show going forward.
And one of the things that I liked about this episode was that sort of contrast between what we saw in episode 1, when you look at how the dynamic between Gordon and Joe, and them working together to sort of figure out the code, and both Joe looking at Gordon sort of a light that says, yes, you can do this, and Gordon saying like, oh, yes, you're pushing me on top of this. And then it's a very different dynamic between Joe and Cameron in this episode, where she's stuck, and apparently the only way she can distract herself is by sleeping with Joe, which doesn't happen, as we see.
I mean, wouldn't we all? Sorry, that's just a little moment of appreciation for Lee Pace in both his wonderful talent and his great beauty.
I agreed. And, check. But I do like that we do see this other sort of working side. And actually, one of the things that we still go about how Joe interacts with these people, right? So Joe is still almost this catalyst, or this person that's sort of like pushing these buttons onto everyone else and pushing his agenda, which we still don't really know what that agenda is, above and beyond like, I want to undercut sort of what I was doing before. You had a good sort of understanding, or you put it very nicely when we were chatting about this, off air.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting in a show that is about failure and success, and our concept of what is a failure and what is a success, and how do we go forward, and how do we do ambition for the future. I think for me, that was the crux of that was in this episode, where Joe sits them down and goes, I want to do what IBM's doing, but it's got to be, like half the size and half the price and twice as fast, right? And the two different reactions to that. So you have a Gordon whose first reaction is, nah, you can't do that. Somebody else has already done it. But then the minute Joe leaves the room, the cogs start turning, and he's like, "But wait, I have workarounds." He's a really granular person, so his reaction to that is like, "Oh, but you could do this, and what if you mounted this to this, and what if you changed everything around?" And the cogs start ticking. Cameron, her reaction is, "This is the wrong playing field. This is not how we make progress. This shit's already 10 years in the past, and I want to build the future." And it just sets up this dynamic right from the start that Gordon is going to represent most of us. Let's face it, Gordon's representing most of us who look at the future as it is and go, how can I tinker with it to make it a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient? And that is a major win for him. And it's not to say that Gordon is wrong about that, but then the show just kind of drops in and posits do we need more Camerons? How many Camerons do we need? Did we think that Joe coming in was going to be a Cameron because he whizzes into town and starts shaking everything up? Did we think he was going to be more of a disruptive visionary type? But also kind of then ticks over this other question sort of simmering on the back burner, which is like, it's fine to be a Cameron. It's fine to see 10 years into the future and say, this is where we're going to be with, and she gives this, like, it's almost a little bit twee the way she rolls off all these things that we know that computers are going to do because they're already doing it. Like, we're watching it aired in like June 2014 and this is already happening. So she rolls off all those things, but at the same time, it's going to take a leap of like 20 years minimum to start getting to the point where this is happening. Like, the technology's not there yet or whatever. It's like, if you are a Cameron, do you have to hold your fire until the conditions are right? Like, do we need the both of them working together? We need the Gordons setting that, like, incrementally improving the landscape until a Cameron can come down and like push it into the future.
But that's a really interesting thought, because that is actually how the technological cycle is actually set up these days. You get your yearly iPhone. Sometimes it looks different. Sometimes it's iterative in terms of we've added another camera, but it looks the same, or we've done software tweaks and it looks the same. So it's actually a really interesting point of view around how do you make technology, and how do you make revolutionary technology versus evolutionary technology, and are both necessary? I think both of them are. But what's interesting is, and I sort of took notes of like Joe's sort of smugness in himself when he walks out of that room and goes, I put 2 and 2, guys, go fight it out. My job here is done. And Gordon's reaction is classic Gordon, but you can already start to see like a little shift when he's like, no, that's impossible. That's impossible. Because again, back to your point from last episode around the mundane and how he sort of has to translate everything to his day-to-day to, hold on. If we suddenly start playing with this and looking into that. And I think it's really funny, the juxtaposition of Cameron saying all these things like computers should like talk to us and know our name and be smarter than us, to I can't sort out the BIOS. I actually cannot figure it out, certainly not by myself. And that tremendous pressure that she's put herself in, because Joe's put her in that pressure. So it is a really interesting sort of concept of where you are as a visionary and where you are as someone that can be a doer and execute on that stuff. So I think that one is an interesting one. Now, very quickly touching on it, we'll dive into this, but I was a bit worried watching this episode because the IBM sort of storyline, let's just call it that for a second, gets resolved in the first 5 minutes. What was set up in the last episode gets resolved. Obviously, we know that that's not the end of it, which is great because it keeps that momentum going. But I was a bit worried that if we're sort of going in there, and Joe was right, everything that he set out to do is like, yep, you're right, and you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. And there's a chunk of character development in between, especially on Cameron, and then you're setting up something else. It felt like initially the structure was going to be a little bit off, but I think they very cleverly played with it, in my opinion. I don't know what you thought about the pace in this episode in comparison to the last.
Yeah, and I think that this may be, like, we talked about the fact that some people felt a little bit weird about the show in the first few episodes and weren't sure where it was going, and that it took a little bit of time to find its feet. And I think it's things like that that may have disquieted people, because first you go, hang on, you did it wasn't feature length, but you did a very long pilot that set up all this thing and made us worry that IBM were going to come crashing down on Cardiff and it was all going to be over. And then you resolved it in 5 minutes. And then it does the incredibly clever thing of going, yes, Joe foresaw that IBM was not going to be a problem. He didn't foresee IBM undercutting Cardiff and taking all their clients away and slowly seeping all the money out of the business. And, he didn't foresee that. And that's what brings you back into it. And you go, oh, the real threat was kind of lurking underneath. And then on top of that, you have the threat of these clashing personalities and clashing visions and clashing ways of working. And they basically, obviously they have to, for legal reasons, separate Cameron from the rest of the office, but they essentially park the woman in a basement and just kind of go, fix the most complicated problem on your own, yeah? While the men do the important thing upstairs. And it's just, that is what keeps the whole thing ticking over. But initially, in the first 10 minutes, you're like, that's a bit Scooby-Doo. Why'd you just suddenly pull the rug out from under everything? And you have to take the leap of faith and go with it to let it kind of take you into this new peril.
They're avoiding having a full episode that's showing us the boring stuff, the sort of litigation and the threats. And I thought it was funny when the lawyers, one of the first scenes, got one-on-one with Cameron, and they were like, come on, how much are they paying you? You're a good kid. We don't want you. We want the bigger fish. And that's the kind of almost cliched sort of big time lawyer from the city. So I'm kind of glad that we skipped all of that. But what that allowed us to see were sort of continuing to underline glimpses of their personality, and sort of Cameron's reaction to that was great. But it never, up until later when we'll talk about that Cameron scene where she's running out of the shopping center, it doesn't really put you in a place where you're like, is anyone going to betray Joe and give themselves up? Those scenes were not designed for that. Those scenes were designed to show that Joe actually picked the right people who's caring for this project, or the ideal of this project is above and beyond just being scared. I mean, let's face it, in the pilot episode, they already technically broke the law by figuring out the BIOS, right? And Cameron sort of jumped in to sort of understand that there's going to be tricky things involved above and beyond just figuring out what the thing should be. So it is good that they don't go back to suddenly Cameron thinking, okay, I'll cooperate with you guys to get something out of it. She already wasn't convinced that what she was getting out of working with Joe, at least on a money level, was the driver. So I'm glad that they didn't really lead us in the wrong path there.
No, and we know that scene is not there to make us doubt Cameron. That we already know from the first episode that she's unimpressed by IBM when she kind of brushes off Joe as ugh, IBM guy. We already know that, she's already staked her claim about how she feels about technology, how she feels about the vision, how she feels about the future. That scene is really there to emphasize the level of battle they're up against. It's not really there to go, oh, maybe Cameron in the future, maybe she'll be selling secrets to IBM. She's not going to fall for any of that shit, because you've already established she's really straightforward. If she believes something or doesn't believe something, she's going to tell you to your face whether you want to hear it or not. And that scene coming off the back of she's just been shoplifting is that kind of sense of oh, she's a bit of a rebel. She's a bit of a rule breaker. No way is she going to be sucked over immediately to the dark side by IBM, who represent all the conformity and all the establishment. They have done everything they possibly can at this point to say Cameron is an anti-establishment figure. Have you worked this out yet? Down to her haircut, my friends. She they put so much into it that scene is never about risking that relationship. It's always about going, you are up against people who will do anything and who will undercut anywhere. And how, it's setting up the tangle going, how is Joe going to, is he going to be good enough at business chess to work this shit out and get us through this problem?
But once again, IBM is just there to trigger Joe more than anything else and sort of give us more layers as to who he is and why he's there. And I'm glad, again, like you said, they didn't go down that route. Now, one of the things that I wrote down as I was watching, and again, I'm watching this for the first time after about 5 years, so 5 or 6 years. So really interesting to pick apart some of these elements and some of the symbolism we touched on in the last episode. But there's this whole human versus machine element to it, and you see that with all the clients that are sort of dropping off Cardiff Electric's Rolodex, right? Everyone's falling apart. And I love that moment where boss is on the phone and Joe is like, let me help you. And he's like, you have no idea what this business is like. This business is built on relationships. And we see that with boss in the classic, let's slap each other on the ass locker room type scene of, we're all friends here, we're all buddies, and like, yeah, let me just check up on you and give you some free software, off the books, whatever. And already you get a glimpse of what IBM is up to, and you have Cameron's sort of speech around what a computer should be, like we said, versus what Joe is saying that he wants to do, which is purely technical. What he wants to do is just let's make it pretty, cheaper, faster. Let's undercut the other guys.
Joe is only interested really at this point, and I don't think you get a sense that this is all he's ever interested in, but you get the impression that at this point, all he's really interested in is shafting where he came from. Like, he came from IBM. There's clearly some sort of mystery there because we know that he dropped off the grid and then like just reappeared at Cardiff Electrical. And something has happened that he just wants to shaft the guys he came from at the moment. It's a very petty, it's a very small vision. And it's weird because we all got the impression that he was coming into town to shake things up. And he's obviously targeted Cameron, knowing what kind of person that she is. And, he went in there
versus running away, you mean?
Yeah, he went in there looking for a Cameron. He went looking for somebody who was going to be disruptive and smart and capable. And now he's setting her a very tiny vision comparatively. And you're just like, well, why? Why does he want to do that? Is he doing it as a stepping stone to something else? Or is he at heart more of a Gordon, somebody who just wants to incrementally kind of shift things? And I mean, just going back to the locker room thing for a second, like I really love that because I can't speak for the writers. I've never spoken to them. I'd love to ask them all the questions.
Come on the show, guys, if you're listening.
Yeah, absolutely. If you ever find this recording, please forgive us and also come and talk to us. I felt like they were kind of going, all that stuff you've ever heard. Like, we've all worked in places where people talk about relationships, right? We've worked in agencies and it's very, very true that relationships are what gets you forward in certain circumstances. Like, if you know somebody, or if you can create a sense of, oh yeah, me too. Yeah, I've been there. I understand that. You are more likely to get the business done and to develop that business and to hold on to it for longer. Like, that is true. But those always come into tension with money. So there is only so far that a relationship can take you before money undercuts it. And that sequence with Boz is just like, you can just see the cynicism of the writers coming through with like, are these real relationships if getting a cheaper deal can undercut them? Or maybe they're saying, in the system we're in the capitalist system we're in, with shareholders who have to get certain returns and blah, 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 is it impossible to have a genuine relationship? Because at some point, the money will force you into decision whether or not you feel happy about making it. Like, there's so much going on in those scenes.
When Boss is on the phone with one of them, he goes, come on, we've been in business for 11 years now. Like, come on, we got to work something out. And it doesn't matter how long you've been in business with. And actually, that just helps Joe, because Joe is like, you see, it doesn't, what you've got here. And I sort of mapped out in every episode, I think, has a theme. And for me, this one is sort of loyalty in loads of different ways. And we'll talk about Cameron and Donna. Obviously, we're going to give that a special section within what we're going to discuss, because it's the first time they meet. But again, the loyalty from these brands, the loyalty from these customers and these clients, that is broken. And it's broken out of money, like you said. It's got nothing to do with you brought the snake into this business that is changing everything. Now, going back to Joe for just 2 seconds and going back to this sort of like human versus machine thing, some of the lighting and some of the positions that he's in, especially when Cameron is trying to figure out, she's whiteboarding everything and all these things that obviously I can understand. He's kind of like the devil.
I bet there's someone who has watched this and has checked it and been like, that's not right. That there is someone out there who has sense checked and coded whatever it is that Cameron had on that whiteboard and found the flaws. And if you're out there, fine, email us if you must, but we're not going to check.
Prove them wrong.
Sorry,
I mean,
you were saying.
As an Argentinian, the amount of things I've seen that are not Argentina and passed off as they are, let's just leave it with Hollywood.
Dude, Penelope Cruz played a Greek. I mean, after this, we're just going to burn it all down. It's
We're all
fine.
going to
Authenticity
hell.
be damned.
But I like that even when Cameron wants to sleep with him, Joe's got the binder. He's almost the angel and the devil on the shoulder of like, you want it, and what's the right thing? And I love that because when Joe is getting his way, he is top notch, neat, and clear thinking. When he's not getting his way, he's throwing shit around. He's thrashing places. He's yelling
Oh
at
my
people.
God, such a man-child.
Such a man-child. But even when he's sort of yelling at Gordon, like, oh, when Gordon's like, you gave her the binder, you basically made me. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. You just can't own up to anything unless you're putting on a mask. So
yeah, he gets all the credit. He gets all the credit for something good and none of the blame for anything bad. Like, he has just set it up so that he is like, and you know, given the writers are two white guys, you know, that level of self-awareness, of understanding of what certain people can get away with, and they must have observed a few people like that, and they must have seen people like Joe in play to kind of write him to understand him so well. But I mean, we've all observed people like that when nothing seems to stick to them, and you're just like, I don't know, I think that was your fault, but somehow you've made it seem like you're a victim in this.
Yeah, well, we know that Joe is, from what we've seen so far, is always going to play victim no matter what. But I was going back to the beginning for a second. I was a bit surprised at like how fast things were moving. Like suddenly Gordon's getting an office. Joe is like getting some made up title, like that even boss doesn't even know. He's like, you're a what, product manager, and like what, like just things that are foreign to them, even though we're in this sort of like business of technology. And the ass licking of Joe when he goes, just so everyone knows, this would not have happened without, the vision of boss. Again, this is him sort of transferring himself to others, thinking that he's enabling them and thinking that he's just adding them to the match, right? It's someone's like, boss, I brought you into this. I'm going to elevate you to people that are, he very much knows the place that these people, these pawns have, without being offensive to anyone, in the machine, right?
Yeah, they're all cogs. And the thing is that it's undercut immediately. Again, the show always wants you to know that you are smarter than what's going on in the room. Like they want to keep you on your toes, but they also register that you can see that this guy is not 100% trustworthy. So he gives this big inspiring speech. The swell starts to move in the right direction. People start to kind of go, I don't know, this guy's a bit shiny and oily, but like he says some nice things. And then he goes into Gordon's office and Gordon is like, stole that line from Steve Jobs. And it's like this wonderful, like clanging bell that just goes, everything that comes out of Joe's mouth is kind of manufactured and it's to do with him, not to do with you. And you can watch the tension in Gordon where mostly he buys into what Joe is saying, but there's just a little thread of him left that is going, this guy may not be entirely authentic, and he knows it, but he kind of does it anyway.
And when Joe is like, yeah, smart guy, right? And I like that Gordon sort of calls him out on that, because Gordon is like, we're led to believe that, he's like, our self-awareness is obviously an issue. He puts his foot in it, even in the beginning where, towards the end where they're saying like, we can't run more than, we lost 67% of our revenue or our income. And Gordon's like, but what about the computer program? It's like, that's like, can you not see that there's like something else happening that is going to get in the way of like your new office? But I love that he calls him out on it, because he does, you're right. Like, he isn't just this follower, right? He is also kind of like, well, hold on. You're not just, you're not being fully truthful.
That's the thing about Gordon, is like, he is definitely one of nature's kind of second runners. Like, things happen, things fail, whatever he does, he gets up, he keeps going. And alongside that, he is smart. Like, he's not a stupid guy. Yeah. It's just that he can't seem to apply the logical stuff to his everyday life. And that is the part of Gordon that I identify with, and I sort of slightly hate myself for identifying with it. But it's that little bit of me that just goes, oh, sometimes I can see straight ahead that logically this situation, like, we've all stayed perhaps in jobs longer than we should have done, or this or that. And you can see logically that the road ahead is not going to get any less messy, but you hang out there for another 3 months because you're like, but they did suggest that maybe things will get better at some point in the future. And Gordon's that guy. He's locked in a permanent cycle of thinking, but what if I just held on for a little bit longer, even though there's a fully logical part of his brain, like presenting the evidence up front and going, this guy is full of crap, but he's still sort of
Yeah.
like, but
Well,
if he's right.
the office, the new office, I love when he's like turning on and off the light switch. It's like, did you not have a light where you were before? Well, no, you're in like some random cubicle. I love that. You're right. He gets sort of like blinded by these gestures. When Joe walks in and goes, you like that office? It's almost like Joe wouldn't have had it any other way. Did you think that Joe was going to come in, apply for a job, and just sit in a cubicle? Of course he's not. He's above everyone else. And it's almost, I admire the Joe-ness of just going for it and selling yourself in a way that positions you as someone confident. Now, I don't like the element of, we touched on this in the last episode, of him not seeing that he is playing people and that what he's saying does have an impact on people. He likes that he has an impact on people, that he can influence, but I don't think he knows how far it goes. And when they're in that situation where they're all this business is gone, Gordon is like, you got a plan, right? Like you surely you saw this coming. And Joe, for once, doesn't have anything to say. And Gordon's like, oh my God, you've tricked me. I bought into this, and you were nothing. And like he just walks out, and then they have the whole scene. And that's the interesting thing about Joe, that he's got to figure it out. He's got to figure it out up to the point that he can, but when it comes to managing other casualties, he's just not there. He can't.
No,
he's a machine.
He just has to find, every time he ends up falling back on a story. Like he ends up falling back on telling a story, and it's like he's like a magician. He ends up falling back on misdirection and going, but look over here to the story, to the vision, to the thing. And then that really just gets hammered down at the end of this episode with the scene with the scars. Because then you have something where you're like, he tells us, I mean, what a performance, first of all. Like, that is just beautiful, because you're so, like, even when your own brain is going to you, I wonder if is this true? Are we finally getting an insight into where Joe comes from? Like, Lee Pace is just extraordinary, and God bless him, he is marvelous. But, he does this wonderful scene, you're rapt, you can't take your eyes off the screen, and then not 5 minutes later, Cameron's like, here is my evidence that is bullshit. But what is really, really interesting, I think, at this point, and it takes us full circle back to Cameron, is that we kind of expect Gordon to go, you said something there that was taken from someone else, or that was made up, or that was whatever, and to let it slide. Like, we know Gordon's going to let it slide. His whole life is letting things slide, or the wrong thing slide, and whatever. But we've just had a setup for Cameron where she has gone like shoplifting. She's done all these like weird things. She's had this weird conversation with IBM. Gordon's rifled through her stuff. Yeah, Gordon's rifled through her stuff and found this doll. And you're like, okay, well, there's something going on there. And like we've had this whole setup that there are layers to Cameron that we haven't seen yet. And then the first layer of those that we see is that when she challenges Joe, and bear in mind, she's been challenging Joe from second one about all things technology, all things vision, all things future, all things work. Now it's a personal story. And she knows full well that he's made this thing up in order to try and kind of engage people. And when he sits back smugly and goes, is that right? She lets it go. And suddenly you get this first layer of insight into Cameron, the human being, not Cameron, the coder, or Cameron, the tech visionary, but Cameron, the person, and her interpersonal relationships with people, which up until now have been this like sexual transactions. And so suddenly we have this insight into Cameron, the person, because up until now, all her interpersonal relationships with people have been about work, or they've been like sexual transactions. And then now we get a layer of emotion. We've got a layer of emotion from Joe that we weren't expecting. And even though she's like pulled back the curtain and gone, I don't believe that's true, I mean, obviously, clearly something still gave that man those scars. So there is some sort of trauma in his past that we are not privy to yet. And she lets it go. And we don't know whether she lets it go because she too, like we know because Gordon's been rifling in her things, like she too is clearly hiding something under those layers. The fact that she hasn't really mentioned any other people in her life, any friends, any relationships, any parents, anything like that. Like we know that she is burying stuff and maybe she respects that he's doing it too. Or maybe there's just like Cameron, the person, when it comes to interpersonal relationships, is way more like naive, is way more easily impressed than Cameron, the work person. Like we don't know, but it's a wonderful, like it's supposed to be a scene about Joe, but it really ends up being a scene about Cameron.
Well, she's almost being she's almost forgiving him in a way, because again, it's just another way of Joe playing victim. It's like, wow, I had this vision and I didn't fit in with anyone else, and I know that's why you guys understand me. And it's I thought that scene was, I mean, he acted it beautifully, as you said, but I just thought, oh, it's like the IBM thing where they're like, your father will be disappointed, but hey, what else is new? It's kind of like those leads that we don't know where they're going to go, and they're just being set up for the sake of making Joe this mysterious character, even though we're sort of seeing this side of him where even if you didn't have those things, it would still have that impact. So from my point of view, that scene was a bit much from what I needed to accomplish to get them on board. Like, if that's the thing that got them on board, then it goes to show that the only way to relate with these two is to drop yourself down to your lowest point rather than to elevate them and tell them that their interview at a magazine was incredible or that their coding skills are, why he sought them out. And we find out that he sought them out specifically. It was no coincidence. I'm going to speak in that uni, or I'm going to go to Cardiff Electric. So that vulnerability that he put on show there is what gets them on board. And I'm really curious to see how that's going to evolve and whether they are going to, how long can everyone continue to function while on the floor from an emotional point of view?
Absolutely. And we know they've already set up the idea that people are going to repeat patterns of behavior, right? Because we know that line of code, that halt and catch fire line of code, means that people are going to repeat certain behaviors, but we don't know which of these behaviors are, and yeah, you can't always start from a position of everybody grinding at the bottom. There are going to have to be peaks and troughs in the story, and we just don't know where they are yet. In a second, I want to come back to kind of Cameron and Donna, since we're on the subject of Cameron, but it kind of feels natural at this point to go, that was maybe my only misgiving about this episode, was that the sheer volume of breadcrumbs, like when I was actually looking at it, and I probably didn't notice this when I was more of a casual viewer, but actually looking at it now to pick through it, I'm just like, you can't resolve all of these. And it does feel a bit like a season one, I'm just going to spray some plot lines at the wall.
Yeah.
And then depending on how many times we get, depending on how many times we get renewed, we'll pick up as many of these as we can. Now, again, we said no spoilers into the future. Some of these will get picked up. We know that. Some of them won't. The only thing with this episode that felt sometimes at times overwhelming was like, oh my God, am I supposed to keep track of all these things that are happening at once? Am I supposed to take note of every single little thing that's going on here? Because there's a lot.
And I think this is where, going back to what put people off, actually, it's a very technical episode. It's a very sort of, you can't really understand what these characters are trying to achieve. I mean, I like that when the secretary or whoever she is telling Cameron, like, oh, by the way, there's like a 3-for-1 sale or whatever. She's like, what do you all do here? And Cameron was like, well, I do this, and it's the BIOS, and I'm trying to, that's what boots up the computer. She's like, so I can write a little letter to my boyfriend? And she's like, yes, you can write a letter to your boyfriend. And she's being nice about it. She's not being this, she's not being condescending of like, oh God, you airhead. Like, you can't look at this from any other point of view.
No, and I will say that is another lovely little bit of Cameron's character development that we see dropped in, is that she is deeply like combative and unpleasant to people that she thinks speak the same language as her. If someone doesn't speak the same language as her, she doesn't condescend, and she just relates to them wherever she can. So when she meets Donna, and we'll unpack that whole thing now, but when she meets Donna, she also meets one of their kids. And while she doesn't communicate very much with them because she's busy like putting on deodorant and brushing her teeth or whatever, she acknowledges the kid directly. And on her, like the kid says something to her and she just kind of nods and like registers something. And a lot of people who don't have kids or who aren't around kids a lot, and you don't get the sense that Cameron's really hanging out down the play park with her mummy friends, like they don't really talk to kids or they don't really know how to handle it. Or they ignore them or they patronize them and pat them on the head. And she doesn't do that ever. She talks quite normally to everyone. Like the only time when she becomes a more kind of enlivened, spiky version of herself is where she feels people are intruding on territory that belongs to her. Like in every other way, she's really pleasant to the receptionist. Like the receptionist is basically telling her, you're a bit underdressed, go sort that out, in a really nice way. But she registers that it's a nice way and she treats her with respect, which I bet no one else in that office does. So, like you get the sense of Cameron having a really like nice human side to her when she doesn't feel threatened. And that's a lovely little, just like a tiny nugget that I really appreciated.
But also it's kind of the only character that isn't expecting anything from her, whether directly or indirectly, because the way that, and let's jump into the Cameron and Donna, but the way that Cameron was set up for Donna was that it was a man. So
Gordon just lets her believe that. And you're just like, why?
And I love how they did that, by the way, because it wasn't like, yeah, we got a new guy. It was just by name and sort of like in assumptions and sort of like, tangling the web. But
she says he doesn't correct her. And then you're just, but it's left as such a like clanging bell over your head because you're just like, why didn't you say anything, Gordon? Why didn't you just say, oh yeah, it's a she? Like it would have been a really quick correction and it never would have been an issue, but it becomes an issue because he didn't say anything. It's just brilliant.
And you sort of wonder like where that's coming from, and was there something in the past, like is there something that we need to know here? But going back to those pressures towards Cameron, Donna had a pressure of Cameron being a man, and when she finds out that it's a woman, it's like, oh, is this going to be another nail in the coffin for something? And
the big question there is Donna uncomfortable that Cameron is a woman because she's a woman and she has some sort of like sexual jealousy, which doesn't feel like Donna, I've got to say. Like she doesn't feel like someone who's particularly insecure or petty.
No.
But is she pissed off that Cameron is a woman because she herself is capable of doing some of this stuff and no one asked her?
I don't know, because she doesn't know what they're working on. And she looks the other way. When she finds him in the garage, she's like, no, not this again. She is sort of like, she's locked that up. She's focused on the girls. And it was great to see her sort of be happy for Gordon when he's like, I've got a new office. And like the contrast of, you brought the girls to, bail me out of jail, to, oh, come on, have them skip school and look at my fancy new office where I can turn the light. I don't know if that's the case, because we don't know what Donna does at TI. We understand that she's part of this world, but we don't know what she's, if she's capable of anything that Cameron is able to do.
No, we know she must have been involved in Gordon's project, because she's been so burned by it. Like we know that she had some involvement in it, but what was her involvement? Was it financial? Was it just supportive? Was she making him cups of tea, metaphorically? Or was she actually, but she did unscrew that speak and spell and start getting into it. And she does work for another technology company. And she is kind of peripherally in that world. And at first I was like, I didn't get the impression that Donna was going to be like a sexually insecure woman. And I was a little bit like you, I was a bit disappointed. I'm like, this doesn't seem like the way this character was going. And then it occurred to me, like, she has been at the periphery of all this tech stuff all this time. Is it a kind of professional jealousy? Like I really couldn't tell. And that left an intriguing kind of question mark over my head about where Donna is coming to. One that I would like resolved in the next few episodes. Like I'd like to see that.
I think you're right. I think you're right when thinking through the fact that some of these, the way that Donna sort of, I mean, I'm glad that they sort of nip it in the bud very quickly. So it happens over the course of, a couple of scenes. But when Donna meets Cameron, and she's obviously, her appearance and her age really give her away. I think maybe that's where she's like, why, to your point, like, if I'm not being asked about this, is it because I chose this other life? I'm a mom and I can't sort of fit that role of you need me to be this rebel and like not care about anything, and I draw balls on my lawyer and I walk away. But the funny thing about Cameron also is that she can't be kept in a cage, right? She just needs to escape. And the shoplifting scene was funny because we don't know what salary she's on. We know that she's on more than Donna,
No,
but
we know she can afford this stuff now, but she's still choosing not to pay for it. And we know that she can afford to buy the fancy stuff and that she even went to the trouble of trying it on and then went, oh my God, no, this is not me.
but I love that she was like, fine, fine, I'll pay for it. Like, you don't need to see her shoving in her, like, again, we go back to these reference points of, um, uh, we don't need to tell you, you can see it yourself. And it was the same exact thing when Donna and Gordon are sort of interacting on that. And actually, interestingly enough, you can see Gordon spark back. I mean, they have sex. They get together. Um he wants to help out. What was it where he's like, oh, I got this, I got this. Like, oh, suddenly
Yeah.
you're in a place where you want to do all these things.
He feels fulfilled at work. So suddenly he becomes a better person at home.
And we've all been there, but I do think that Donna, I do wonder whether she's a bit resentful towards the fact that she couldn't do anything to help him be this person, yet someone comes along and suddenly, it's like
Be that Joe or Cameron.
sparkle in your eyes, or even Boss, because I feel like even Boss sort of like talks down to Gordon quite a lot, but like in a friendly sort of fatherly way of like, Joe, like, Gordon, just go back to your box because I know you.
Boz is super paternalistic. Like,
Yes.
Boz is really paternalistic, but he's not harsh most of the time.
No.
And so you get a sort of vibe off him that you're like, you're a bit of like you're a dinosaur. Like, the world's moved on around you and but you sort of feel sorry for him because he like really believes in human relationships. Like, he takes it super personally that all these people are walking out on him. And in that sense, he and Gordon, who both have quite an old school like loyalty mentality, you can see why that relationship kind of works out for them because they're both kind of coming from the same place of like, but if we do this if we do the right things, we should get the right output. And they're both a little bit baffled by that equation not always working in the real world, that if you put in the stuff over here, you'll definitely get the stuff out over there.
Well, this is where I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Joe sort of fits in the Gordon and Cameron triangle, because if we establish that by the beginning of the episode, Cameron could be a a visionary of sorts, and Gordon's sort of that technical dude that is able to just get on and iterate on something that's existing. Where is Joey going to fit into that? Because we see him lose his cool, like we said, on her not being able to figure something like that out. And so I do think that Boss is going to play some sort of role in balancing out the equation, because he is very much like Gordon from the point of view of like, I know what works. I'm proud of what I've accomplished in the relationships that I built. He tells us from, in the first episode, I've been in this business for 20 years and I'm the VP of sales, again, as if that's meant to mean something to everyone else. But you're right, he is relatable. Like, he doesn't talk down to anyone. He's there, right? Like, when people are shouting about like, we're losing, whatever airlines or this, Boss picks up the phone. And I don't know
Yeah.
about you, but I work in a
He does
massive
the work.
corporation where a lot of superiors to me have no clue what the day-to-day is like, because they wouldn't get their hands dirty anymore, right? They're just there to sign the
Like,
checks.
I should say I work in completely the opposite environment where there's a very small handful of us and everyone does everything. So yeah, but it's so refreshing. It's so wonderful when you're like, oh my God, you have like this much more experience than me and this and that, the other, and you're actually doing the work. And for Boz to visibly in the room do the work of the day to day, pick up the phone in front of the sales guys, like, you can see why he's inspired loyalty and been leading that group for a really long time. And so when he is a little bit patronizing, when he is a little bit paternalistic at times, you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe you've earned it. Like, maybe you've earned it because you're willing to actually get your hands dirty and get the job done.
And he doesn't think twice, right? Like, I've been in situations where someone is telling me what to say while I'm on the phone. Okay, he could have easily been like, "Tell him this." No, to that. He picks up the phone. He's not. There's a bigger. There's, in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot more going on that we need to resolve. But yeah, I think, and jumping into some of the camera work that I've noticed sort of evolved from the first episode. That really does help underline some of these things from different points of view. But already from the first scene, we're getting the camera sort of thrown in the middle of the table, completely stabilized. It's on its side, and what I've noticed that it actually gets more unstable as the episode progresses, and that's such a nice sort of way of escalating the. If you think about what we said in the beginning of our recording around the fact that the IBM thing gets solved in the first 5 minutes and then sort of like goes down and then comes up, the camera work actually continues to intensify throughout, where you can sort of like see that something is happening, but you can't really put your finger on it. So this is where I think that second watch is really interesting. And going back to what we said in the last episode around the layers of people in between, and what I notice is that the camera always features whenever there's two people in a room or three, there's always two people in one shot, whether they're behind sort of someone else, blurred, not in focus, whatever. But when it's about one character like Cameron trying to sort out how the bias will work, or Joe figuring out what he's going to do, the camera is like really in a tight space, like sort of like just focusing on their facial expressions. And I just think that's such an interesting play with some of these devices, because you're always acknowledging everyone else in the room, and that it's not sort of like a monologue of like Joe is speaking to everyone and the camera's only on him from the bottom to sort of elevate him, and then you get a reaction shot. It's just natural. And I
I
really.
absolutely love that. I love that. I love that the camera is about relationships then. So either when it's one person, it's locked in tight to their mental state, and when it's about two people, it backs out just enough to go, this is a conversation, you should see both sides of it at the same time. That's just incredibly clever, and I love it.
And the camera is also, like we said before, never in the way. It's never sort of, it's put in the middle of the table. It's put like behind the mannequin while Cameron's shopping around. It's never sort of in a place where it would be getting in the way, if that makes sense.
It's not obtrusive, and it
No.
doesn't stop people relating naturally because they had to relate around a camera. So yeah.
It doesn't feel like a stylized device. You get a lot of shows, and I'm looking at you, Ryan Murphy, where it is so much style over anything else, and like the jumps, the jump cuts, and the editing, and the sort of camera work that comes out of nowhere through a chandelier and that's right. This is not that. This is like
no. There's no showboating. There's no showboating
No.
whatsoever. Like, it is all in the service of the storytelling.
When Joe is speaking to Gordon after he's sort of trashing that room, and he's on the other side, and the camera sort of looking at Gordon, but focusing on Gordon, but looking at Joe, and the other way around. They're sort of in this divided. It looks like they have that rail, sort of that fence dividing them. And again, it goes to show that when they come together, the camera is involving them in such a way that you can understand like they're in a good place. When they come apart, they put these obstacles in between, and that's what we referenced last episode around the rope and the Donna situation, etc.
Yeah, and in this one, there's a really, I think sure it's the beginning of this episode where Cameron is, I think, talking to the receptionist, and overhead in the back of the shot is a really like an exit sign, like a big red
Yes.
exit sign, and it's just like, Cameron, last chance. Get out of this mess while you can. And I love that those could just get dropped in. Like, yes, you can get heavy-handed with symbolism, but I just think it does it so elegantly that you don't mind it at all. It's kind of like, here you've had your noose and your exit sign and your
Yes.
big wire, like your big metal
Rail,
wall
yeah.
here. Like, there couldn't be any more clear signs that these four people are going to be trouble whenever they're involved with each other. And I mean, I absolutely love that. And you pointed out to me it's actually the same director, which may be what that, plus the fact that it picks up immediately where the last one leaves off. Like, I think if you watched episode 1 and 2 back to back, you would almost feel like you had watched a film.
They're very connected. It's not, and we talked about this, it's not Boardwalk Empire where you got Scorsese attached to it. But after the first episode, he sort of drops off and becomes an exec producer, for example, and that directing or goes to someone else. I really think that you can tell when he's directed some of these episodes, and you're right, it feels like it's chapter 1 and 2, and they fit in together very nicely. In fact, episode 2 could almost fit into the middle of episode 1 if you looked at it, if you were looking at it from a film point of view. But it's a really interesting approach that continues to underline the tone of the show. And with this, one of the things that I start to wonder, and I don't know if you feel the same, is how much of a big deal is the IBM stuff and the computer stuff versus their connection and what they're trying to achieve? Because, and this is like the setting up of all these leads in terms of, you get the binder, like how much of a difference does it make for you to just use the binder, aside from sort of breaking the law, versus creating something from scratch? Like, do you get any sort of satisfaction or reward after that? Or, is it about the fact that Joe is setting up an impossible mission for these guys, almost a suicide mission, because we're seeing that the revenue is not coming in, you're breaking the law potentially, and for all we know, there is nothing that Joe brings. There's no numbers that he's like, this is going to get us X amount. Although I did really enjoy when Joe tells Cameron, well, you made the computer twice as fast and you undercut the price by half. So suddenly you get twice the people using it, but because they're using it faster, twice the people. And she's like, did you come up with all of that by yourself, or did someone help you out? It's just like, she doesn't care. And should we?
No. And I mean, I know we talked earlier about that kind of IBM scene with her being about sort of setting up IBM as the bogeyman and this and that, the other. And Cameron's not going to go for that. What is really interesting is when you compare that temptation, right? IBM come to her and go, we'll shower you with money. And she's like, you never doubt for a second that she's just going to tell them where to go. When Joe presents the binder, that is a genuine temptation to her, not because she wants to cheat. The opposite. She wants to create her own thing. She doesn't want to do what they're doing, but the temptation is there because she wants to see how other people have done it. Like, she's curious about the way all these things work, and she's frustrated with this problem that she wants to work out. But it's this kind of genuine temptation for her. And she feels bad about it because she is a person who wants to create, who desperately wants to be original. Her thing is making something no one else has made before, but he's dangling in front of her, here is the solution to the problem. And it's a genuine, tension.
One of the things he says is, progress depends on changing the world to fit us. And, that got me thinking, does that ring true of Cameron and Gordon as well? Because yes and no. And I thought that was an interesting sort of breakdown in saying, this is it, guys. Like, this is why we're in business together. This is why I picked you. And I don't know if he's manipulating them or if he's setting them up in a way that doesn't ring true to who they are. But that sort of psychopath of the world needs to fit our vision.
Once again, he's not even being original in this. So in the same way that when he made that kind of dramatic speech at the beginning, then Gordon was like, Steve Jobs, he's quoting George Bernard Shaw. So the quote in question is, the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable men. In his whole philosophy of life, he's not even really still being original. And I'm sure Shaw himself would have probably been standing on the shoulders of other giants. But
sure,
he is already borrowing and fitting and taking whatever quotes and philosophies he needs to get what he wants. In some ways, you have to wonder, does Joe even really have a philosophy?
Does he believe them?
Or is he just working things out as he goes along?
Well, I think so that brings us to, what do you think is going to happen in the next episode? Because we have this very sort of tight-knit story from episode 1 and 2. How do we move forward?
Well, yeah, the questions are, how, if they resolve the IBM thing incredibly quickly, are they going to stretch out the technology thing now? Or is this going to be another thing that gets, they resolve the BIOS issue really quickly and then we move on to the next thing? Is that going to be the pattern of the show from now on? Are we going to get any more insight into Joe that is actually accurate, or is he going to keep spinning yarns? Like, at any point, are we ever going to be able to trust this guy? I really want to know where Donna fits in, because so far she's obviously very key to Gordon and his character development. And the one interaction that she's had with Joe back in episode 1 is where she basically just shut him down and blew him out the way and was just like, yeah, you're done. I don't want to talk to you right now. I want to talk to my husband. But you feel like there may be, like, she's now been introduced to Cameron in this kind of weird, wonky way. You get the question of, is there a showdown with Joe building somewhere down the line? Because she can have as many showdowns as she likes with Gordon and they don't go anywhere.
But is that showdown related to Gordon? Is it dependent on whether Gordon is on the right track or not? Or does it become more personal with her?
Right. So, like you were saying, you want to know where Joe fits into the kind of Gordon-Cameron dynamic. Like, where is he going to... Because he's set them both off and now he's bouncing between the two and reacting to them in very different ways. But, like, how is that triangle going to work itself out? I want to know, like, how is the square going to work itself out? Like, where is... like, Donna's kind of nascent insecurity, is that about Cameron's femininity? Is it about her work? Like, what's going on there? So I'm like really hoping the next couple of episodes are much more like Donna focused and we see a lot more of what's going on from that perspective, because there are some really interesting tensions saying, but there's so much spilled out in this episode that I almost don't know which thread to pick up first.
No, and we've seen this episode, I think, be more, in my eyes, all about Cameron. So obviously in relation to Joe as well with all the other IBM stuff. But I do wonder whether the next one is going to be about just Gordon or just Donna. And I don't mean just them, but we'll focus on them a little bit more and sort of get to know them. Like, are we going to continue just unraveling, like peeling the layers? Or is that going to be through that central story of the tech in this particular product? Or will this be a particular product? Like, is it going to have a name and a thing? Or is it just going to be one more thing that it's like the software? It's like, oh, we sell software. We don't know what that software does or who that's for.
Absolutely. And like the one bit that we haven't really touched on this, almost because I didn't know what to do with it, was the scene in the stereo store where Joe kind of loses his shit. It's almost like feels like it belongs to another episode slightly. So I just want to know, is this a Joe classic? Does he every so often just go and lose it? Like, and if he does,
this is the
what's he going to break next?
The guy from IBM was like, "Here's your check. You never came back to us." That's another thing. He was like, "I've done $2 million worth of damage," and you're just sort of like, "Are you this? Is this going to happen again? Like, who is going to be on the other side of these Joe sort of like lunacy attacks? And is that why you had all these cards on you in the first place?"
Like, he's come in, killed an armadillo, brought down a company, and like basically lost his whatever in a stereo store. Like, what damage can you possibly do next? And clearly there is this kind of physical damage that he's sustained, and you're beginning to wonder, did you do that to yourself?
Yeah.
So, and if you did, my God, there's a whole other thing going on.
Do you have daddy issues? Is that why the IBM lawyer's like, your daddy? We bought you a ticket. And that's the thing. It's like, when they're like, we got you a ticket, daddy wants to see you. Does daddy own IBM?
Yes. Like, who is dad in this? Like, is he important? And
or is Joe that good that they want to have him back? Like, which is it?
Yeah. Like, is he dangling Joe on a string? Like, is Joe trying to break away from something?
Yes.
So, lots of questions. Lots of things that are still really exciting. I'd urge anyone to think, wow, this is getting messy, to hang in there, because it's going to be an interesting ride through the rest of this season, which is not very long. There's only another 8 episodes to go, and they're going to have to resolve a hell of a lot. So we will be back in a week to pick up with episode 3 and see what happens with that. And in the meantime, you can find us on Twitter. We have a Twitter feed just for the podcast, which is at TTTGYTTT. See if you can work out what that stands for.
And please subscribe to the podcast if you're enjoying it. That way you're guaranteed to get notifications when we publish new episodes on a weekly basis. So keep watching, loads to unpack, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you soon.